So as we start off in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the importance of infill development. We'll be framing this in the context of what is neighborhood scale development? What is infill development? And why is it important? Why is this something that we even want to promote in our communities? So let's start off with that question. What is infill development? And generally we can think of infill development as occurring in underdeveloped or undeveloped parcels that are within areas that have existing development patterns. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's one type or one use. So it's not just commercial, it's not just residential. It actually can be both. So these images really illustrate the two ends of that spectrum. So this can be development that happens within a Main Street context, maybe a more commercial context. And it can also happen within an existing residential or predominantly, single family, two family sort of neighborhood context that may have some commercial uses mixed in. Those are both considered infill development, and they're types of development that we want to address in this course. So some of the tools that we'll be talking about may be better suited for commercial or may be better suited for residential, but they both are infill development. These areas are generally located in the older parts of the city that have some existing infrastructure. So think of the types of development patterns that may have happened before the 1930s. So these are maybe more gridded, they're perhaps a little bit more walkable, generally a little bit smaller scale, and they'll often happen either around neighborhood cores or your neighborhood main streets and the sort of supporting residential that happens in the next ring outside of that. So that's generally where you can think of whenever we're referencing where this type of development may happen. It's going to be in those walkable areas that were generally developed pre-World War II. And there are different reasons why that development may have happened. The era of development was just less car-centric, and so it was slightly more compact, but also it was in the era of streetcar suburbs. Even if you're in a big city, so where I am in Atlanta, we have streetcar suburbs that are very much part of the city that fill in town today, and they were that way because they were predominant streetcar stops, and so they have little commercial nodes that serve those neighborhoods, and then you have the communities backing up to it. And then we get to the issue of scale. How big is infill development? And there isn't necessarily a specific cutoff, but generally they're smaller scale, they're generally more incremental, and usually these are local actors. These are local driven. So it's not a sort of regional or a multi-state developer that's coming in, for the most part, and developing these infill developments. These are generally done by either mom and pop developers or just a local neighborhood architect or real estate agent who is interested in expanding their portfolio or wanting to have an investment property and think that it would be great to have that little coffee shop on the corner or that ADU in somebody's backyard. So these are generally locally driven projects, and that really is the key to why this type of development is both necessary and it's also what makes them challenging. We can also think about the lot size of infill development. So while these are in existing neighborhoods, that generally means that they're smaller lots, they have limited or no parking, which means that they can tend to be a bit constrained, so you have a limited amount of space that you're having to work within. And the buildings that exist within infill development, they can range from uses. They can have a traditional mix of uses that may be retail on the ground floor with some residents above. Maybe it's a threeplex house, that's purely residential, or just a corner store or a corner coffee shop. Generally, these buildings have smaller footprints, and that is sometimes informed by the era of when a lot of these developments were built, but because they're smaller lots, of course, that naturally will lead to smaller building footprints. And in general, the idea of infill development, because they are in these tighter-knit communities, they tend to be pedestrian-oriented, and that's a key part of the design that we want to continue, and it's why we want to foster this infill development. And this often includes a lot of rehabilitation of existing structures. So infill development doesn't just mean new design. It can also be rehabilitation or reimagining of a structure. Maybe something that was an industrial use 20 years ago turned into a brewery 10 years ago, and it may turn into loft apartments 10 more years down the road. And so that rehabilitation of that existing structure is also a part of what's included in infill development. So let's think about what infill development is not. It is not style specific. So some people may look at this image and say, well, that's not infill development, it's pretty contemporary. But infill development is really style agnostic. It can be traditional in that it reflects whatever the built pattern, the character and context of that existing neighborhood or area, or it could be totally contemporary or new. It's really more about the size and scale of the development, more so than the architectural style. So it is not necessarily dictating a specific architectural style. It's also not greenfield development. So this is often confused. People just assume infill development means any sort of pedestrian-oriented development. And while that is absolutely a key part of it, what infill development is not is when communities may be developed on the edge of town, and yes, they may have a walkable component, they may be mixed use, but when they are acres and acres in scale, and it's in new greenfield patterns, meaning undeveloped land previously on the edge of town without existing infrastructure, that is truly a different type of development pattern. That's not necessarily what we're talking about in this course. The types of development we're talking about really exist in areas that are already developed and are the redevelopment of things like parking lots or a vacant parcel or an underutilized parcel, and less so new, sort of traditionally styled development that's happening on the edge of town on a big greenfield site. So now that we understand a bit about what infill development means when I say incremental development or small scale development, let's understand why it's important. So these are a couple national organizations. Planetizen, this organization that we're taking the course from here, is the first one that I want to quote. And the article, I think, does a really good job of explaining what small scale and incremental development is and why it's important. This article says the craft beer model of walkable urban places. And I think that's a really apt comparison because, we all know the sort of big behemoth beer providers, and we sort of have the big behemoth developers, but craft beer really is local and of the place, and that's what small scale development is. It's why it's important. It's reflective of that cultural and community values that we have. And in the course it says small urban developers can succeed by understanding the project is the neighborhood. That's what makes this place special, right? Even the tiny development can build value and contribute to a community. That's the value of small scale development. And APA, the American Planning Association, talks about how infill development can support community connectivity, can create walkable destinations, expand housing stock, provide opportunities for economic growth, improve air quality, improve water quality, protect existing natural resources by avoiding sprawl. These are all the things that we try to adhere to as planners. This is what we want for our communities, and incremental development is an essential piece of that. And then there are even organizations like the Incremental Development Alliance that are nonprofit, and they're trying to help train and advocate for why this type of development is important. And the way that they talk about it is that these are the kind of places we want to live in, and they're built and maintained by the people who really love them. And so that really gets to the sort of stickiness of small-scale development. Because it is done by people who are local to the community that really care and understand and know about the place, then it really adds to that community value and to the longevity of the types of uses and businesses and residents that will find use for the small-scale development. So let's talk about some key takeaways from this chapter. What are the things that we really need to know moving forward? The first is that infill development has economic, social, and environmental benefits. This small-scale development occurs in areas with existing infrastructure, so we have parking, we have utilities, we have streetscapes. And that means this development is less expensive. And that's really important from an approachability and an equity perspective. You think about a small business, or maybe someone just coming out of high school and college that maybe don't have the resources to live, anywhere, but this small scale, more affordable housing can be a great place for them to start off. They're also smaller footprints and they have lower costs. And so that really gets at that rent, that lower rent. So it caters to local businesses, it caters to lower income residents. So people can really grow as they progress through life or they progress through their community within the neighborhood. And the development in walkable areas also helps reduce that car dependency and sprawl. So as we start to think about how our communities can become more resilient and more sustainable, this infill development is a key piece of that. We also need to think that infill development is fine-grained and locally driven. These are unique projects that happen on unique sites. And that's the character that makes these really desirable, but it's also what makes these really challenging to build under most development regulations. And that's really what we're going to get at the remaining of this course. We're going to talk about what some of those barriers are and how we can start to reduce those barriers through our development codes to get this type of development that's really essential for the future of our places.